Mario Kart World introduced some new mechanics to give the driving a more unique feel, one of which is charge jumping. When driving in a straight line, you can hold down the drift button to start a charge jump, which then gathers blue, orange or rainbow mini turbos depending on how long you hold it for. When you release it, you do a small jump into the air, and when you land, the mini turbo activates. Charge jumps are used quite a lot in races for shortcuts or for small time gains, but only ever with a blue mini turbo. Holding a charge jump for an orange or rainbow mini turbo is literally never worth it, because whilst you gather a charge jump, you'll be driving at a much slower speed than normal, cancelling out any benefits of a longer mini turbo boost. You also lose quite a lot of handling when charge jumping, so you can't navigate the tracks anywhere near as easily. This is especially clear when you're trying to take a tight turn, as you'll likely end up driving straight off the road or into a wall. Today, I thought I would see just how difficult it truly is by going through each of the 30 standard tracks and trying to complete a lap whilst constantly gathering a charge jump. The rules here are simple. I start a charge jump before crossing the start line, and then try to complete a lap of the track without ever releasing it. I am not allowed to touch any off-road or drive into any wall, that way it will be a proper test of how tight you can turn. I decided to use the Goomba character class on the Rob Hog for this challenge, since that gives me the most handling possible when driving on a regular road, hopefully helping me complete as many tracks as possible. With that said, let's get straight into it, starting off on Mario Bros Circuit. With this track being the first one in the game, the road is pretty wide throughout, giving me more than enough space to take every turn on the track with no struggle whatsoever. Whilst I did this, I actually realised the turning wasn't as bad as I first imagined, giving me hope that more tracks might actually be completable than I thought. After crossing the line, I quickly moved on to the next track, Crown City. Since this track has 3 different sections rather than 3 laps of the same circuit, I just reversed at the start and then started a charge jump before getting past the starting point. In section 1 there is a thin road between some brick walls, but the turns weren't tight enough to cause me any issues. The big turn around the grass shortcut isn't too tight either, but I did have to use my brakes to stop myself accidentally going up the half pipe. Section 2 begins with another wide turn before a few jumps across the rooftops, which looked like it was going to work just fine until the very last jump, where I didn't have enough speed to land on the other side of the gap. I realised this would probably be possible if I gathered up some coins to increase my top speed, so I restarted the track and grabbed as many of them as possible. I managed to get 17 of them before trying again, and that turned out to be easily enough to avoid falling off for a second time. I was worried that the jump into the trophy soon after might cause a similar problem, but thankfully the landing extends outward enough for it to be possible. Now up next is a glider ramp, which is a big obstacle in this challenge. Of course, if you activate your glider, then your charge jump gets cancelled out, and you can't immediately land into another charge jump either. So I needed to figure out a way to skip this glider whilst keeping my charge jump activated. Luckily, on my very first attempt, I noticed that the glider ramp didn't extend all the way across the edge of the platform, so I just went as far to the left as possible and dropped onto the road below. I did then accidentally drive onto the rail, which cancelled my charge jump anyway, but at least I'd proven it was possible to skip the glider whilst holding my charge jump. So I went back to do it again without then driving onto the rail, which allowed me to continue on to the final section of the track. The turns here are all pretty wide, so I didn't have any issues getting to the finish line at all, making Crown City possible in a constant charge jump. Whistle Stop Summit has a lot of rails to avoid throughout. Luckily though, there is space on the bridge to steer clear of them. The difficulty of this track came with the next big turn though, since I needed to avoid ending up too far on the right at the exit so I didn't touch the rail. On my first attempt, I tried taking a wide line and using my brake, but the turning circle of the bike wasn't enough to keep me away from the rail. Straight after, I went back and tried again, and after braking even more than before, I got very close to the rail again, but was just about able to turn away from it before attaching. The final turn wasn't easy either, but it was doable, making it 3 for 3 tracks so far in this challenge. Sadly, this 100% streak would come to an end on DK Spaceport, since there is a glider ramp at the start that is completely unavoidable without releasing my charge jump. To be fair, the first turn before the glider isn't all that easy, but I could use the top path at first, then drop onto the bottom to make it possible. Now as I say, the glider just completely cancels my charge jump, but I decided to carry on afterwards just to see if the rest of the track would have been doable. The only real talking point is the U-turn on each lap, but it turns out the road is just about wide enough to make it around without having to bump into the wall. Also, the bounce pads on sections 2 and 6 don't actually cancel the charge jump, so keeping it throughout the whole track would have been possible if it weren't for the glider panel. Desert Hills has the windy road section at the end that I thought might cause me issues, but it turned out I would only have to navigate the first 2 turns here thanks to the ramp all the way on the left, which gave me a straight line to follow towards the finish line. Although the first time I went off this ramp I landed in the off-road, but I only had 1 coin. So I tried again with a few more coins I grabbed along the way, and this time I easily landed on the road below, letting me cross the finish line. Shy Guy Bazaar has an obvious problematic section, the tight S-bend in the middle of the track. When I first tried it, I just entered the turns wide and tapped the brakes as much as possible, and I actually made it pretty far until I started to go way too wide on the final turn. However, I realised I didn't need to survive the final turn in the same way as the previous ones, thanks to having this bottom path as a backup plan, so I did get past the tightest turns on the track. Unfortunately, there is another unavoidable glider at the end here, so Shy Guy Bazaar isn't completely possible, but it did give me confidence that some of the tightest turns in the game could be doable on future tracks. Wario Stadium just so happens to be a track with a few extremely tight turns, mainly towards the ending. There is a lot of space to work with on the U-turn before the big ramp, so that one isn't too hard. However, the turns after the big ramp are much less forgiving. After bouncing off the engine, I landed on the left, then held right and tapped brake the entire time, but the booster gave me too much speed and sent me into the off-road. On the next attempt, I ended up bouncing off the wall, which breaks the rules, but it let me find out that the next turn would be doable if I got there without hitting the wall. So I tried again, maximising the use of my brakes and just about got around the turn, but then I had a worse approach for the next turn. Luckily, there was just enough space for me to wrap around without hitting the off-road on the right, making Wario Stadium possible without losing your charge jump. Airship Fortress of course has a huge unavoidable cannon glider section, so it is automatically impossible, but the rest of the track is still worth trying out. One of the most notable sections is the entrance to the indoor area of the ship, as you have to take a full U-turn with fairly little space. Despite that, I did manage to get around without hitting any walls, but it was incredibly close. The other notable section is of course the long spiral after the glider, which I first thought would definitely be impossible. When I landed from the glider, I started a charge jump immediately, and it quickly looked like my suspicions would be correct. However, just as I was getting really close to the outside wall, I managed to start turning away from it to continue down the spiral. This was really surprising to me. When I got to the end of the spiral, I was pretty shocked it was possible. As you can probably tell by now, I'm able to turn much more reliably when gathering a charge jump than I originally thought. I did not expect every single turn up until this point to be doable in this challenge. However, the most difficult one so far was coming up next, and I didn't even realise it until I got there. On DK Pass, I could get past the first half of the track with no problems, but as I was going through the tree section, I realised that the next 2 turns would be really tricky. When I started turning to the left, I noticed I wasn't going to make it around unless I slowed down loads, but I ended up braking too hard and cancelling my charge jump entirely. So on my next attempt, I approached it from much further on the right to give myself more space, which did work as I didn't get caught in the off-road on the right, but it caused me to have an absolutely dreadful approach angle into the right turn straight after, so I went directly into the heavy snow on the left. On the next try, I went literally as far to the right side as possible before the left turn, and this allowed me to enter the right turn in the middle of the road rather than all the way on the right. As a result, I avoided the off-road on the left at the exit, and could continue down onto the final long turn, which actually wasn't easy to pull off despite the road being so wide. In fact, I actually failed it on my first attempt because I slowed down too much again, but on the next try I got as close as possible to the heavy snow without actually touching it, proving DK Pass as possible without losing your charge jump. Starview Peak isn't quite the same story, because all the turns here are incredibly easy to do, yet the track is not possible at all thanks to the 2 glider sections, neither of which are possible to completely skip whilst gathering a charge jump. Sky High Sunday has a glider section of its own, also making it impossible to complete, as the only other path involves riding a rail, which of course also cancels my charge jump. Once again, the rest of the track is very easy, but sadly it has to be ruled out. A track with no glider section on it is Wario Shipyard, as it instead has a lot of water to drive through. When I was going through the water sections here, it actually felt like I had way more handling than I had throughout the rest of the challenge so far. The thing is though, I didn't notice it at all on Starview Peak, which I think is because there is a speed multiplier in the water section on that track, so the handling is balanced out there. Whereas on Wario Shipyard, I could turn as much when charge jumping in the water as I can when I'm not charge jumping, and I have no idea why. Either way, it didn't really matter because the only difficult part of the track was the turn on the ship, but I still managed to do it in only one try, making Wario Shipyard possible without losing your charge jump. Koopa Troopa Beach is the next track, and this one turned out to be the easiest in the video for sure. There is so much space to work with to get around the constant left turns in a lap. Faraway Oasis isn't quite as simple as that, but it's not much harder in all honesty. The boost ramp jump is easily possible with any number of coins, and I could stay in the water in the next section to avoid touching any off-road, since I would have to touch a sliver of dirt in order to go onto the top path. As I said earlier, turning in the water is incredibly easy, so that big turn didn't do anything to worry me. Of course, the ending is another U-turn, but there is so much space to work with here, it is very easily gotten past. Peach Beach of course has an incredibly simple section 1 to get past, but there are a couple of tight uphill turns at the start of section 2. At this point though, I was very much familiar with how to navigate these types of turns, so I got past both of them on the first try, cutting it a bit closer with the left wall on the second one. Unfortunately, section 3 begins with another glider ramp. The rest of the track afterwards is obviously doable, but there is no way to avoid this glider section. I tried going on the top path beforehand and that makes no difference at all, plus the rooftops on the right are unreachable without releasing the charge jump. Salty Salty Speedway also has a glider section, but luckily it's on an optional path, so you can just drive through the track like normal whilst charge jumping and you'll be completely fine. To be fair, the long left turn at the start was a bit sketchy. I did brake just enough to avoid hitting the fence on the right, but it was very close. An even more difficult left turn was up next at the start of Dino Dino Jungle. The road is a bit thinner than normal and it's pretty tight. On my first try I hit the brake a bit too much because it looked like I wasn't going to get around the turn, cancelling my charge jump, but then on my second try I used a bit of extra space on the right to have a wider entrance into the turn, and after slowing down as much as I could I got super close to the grass but didn't make any contact with it. The final turn of the track is the only other tight one here, but the road is incredibly wide so it isn't really an issue. So Dino Dino Jungle is possible without losing your charge jump. Great Question Block Ruins has an S-bend like Shy Guy Bazaar, but this time there is no backup path to rely on if I go too wide. The road itself is a bit wider here though, so I was actually pretty safe on the first turn. The second turn was a bit trickier because I started turning a bit late, but I still got around it with no real trouble. Then, each of the clouds act in the same way as the bounce pads on DK Spaceport, so I could get through most of the track after the S-bend, until I reached the massive glider section which obviously makes the track impossible. Cheap Cheap Falls caused no problems for me at all with no tight turns to navigate, and the same goes for Dandelion Depths. The road is extremely wide throughout so you can get past everything pretty easily. To be fair, I did get very close to hitting the barriers at the end, but I still got past it on the first try. Boo's Cinema has no problematic turns throughout either, but there is a glider panel towards the end, which so far has been the only cause of a track not being possible. This one is similar to Crown City though, as you can skip it when driving regularly by just jumping off the right side of the road before hitting the panel. So that is exactly what I tried here, but I had nowhere near enough speed. So I tried again, but this time used a mushroom, something I hadn't had to do for the entire challenge so far. It still wasn't enough though, I was always falling slightly too short. The maximum number of coins I could get in one lap was 8, but that was only ever enough to land on the rail and get picked up by Lakitu. The eligible landing zone is directly after this rail, but it was constantly just slightly too far for me to make. Even if I got 20 coins, I still couldn't do it, so Boo Cinema is sadly not possible as far as I can tell, but it's definitely the closest to being completed out of the impossible ones. Drybone's Burnout also has a glider section in the middle, where you fly over a lake of lava and land in the huge Drybone's skeleton. Thankfully, this lava can be driven through, but only if you use mushrooms. So I could drop down on the side of the road, then use my mushrooms to get to the other side without losing my charge jump. The rest of the track is fairly simple, making this the first track made possible solely thanks to using mushrooms. Moo Moo Meadows is one of the easiest tracks to complete in the video. The road is extremely wide throughout, so I had no issue getting through it. Choco Mountain also has very wide roads, but the ramp near the start of the lap actually didn't send me far enough over the chocolate to keep my charge jump, since it acts in the same way as the lava on Drybone's Burnout. So to continue through the track I had to use a mushroom before I landed, but as I say, the rest of the track is extremely simple to navigate through. As you'll have noticed throughout the video, the majority of the time I either have to deal with a turn being very tight or a glider panel cancelling my charge jump. But on Toad's Factory, a unique challenge arose. The turns on the track weren't all easy, but there was nothing I hadn't dealt with before, whereas at the end of the track there is a straightaway completely covered by off-road. Of course, I'm not allowed to touch any off-road in this video, so I had to figure out a way to get past it whilst not losing my charge jump. Luckily, there are 4 tractors that go back and forth covering the boost panels in the off-road, and I can actually drive onto the closer ones without making any contact with the off-road. When I first did this, my charge jump cancelled once I landed thanks to the significant reduction in speed, making me think I probably needed to use my mushrooms again, especially since there was quite a lot of off-road to jump over after the second row of tractors. It worked. Jumping across to the second tractor, then getting as much height as possible got me to the other side. The landing was incredibly close, so I decided to do it again with more coins to get even further, and that made it undoubtedly possible to complete Toad's Factory without losing your charge jump. On the contrary, Bowser's Castle is absolutely not possible thanks to 2 of the gliders. The rest of the track is very doable though. Even in the high speed section I had no trouble getting around the turns. Acorn Heights is a similar story thanks to the long glider near the start, plus the road being more than wide enough to get past every turn on the track. This would severely change on the next track though, Mario Circuit. Finally, we have a track with really thin sections to give me a proper challenge. There are 2 U-turns on this track, the first one being in section 2 before the big boost ramp. This one is not too difficult to get past though. You can go quite wide beforehand to give yourself a bit more space to get around the turn, but this is not the case for the other U-turn in section 3. This is without a doubt the tightest turn in the game. It is practically a full 180 with a thin road at both the entrance and exit. The only saving grace is that the road doesn't get even thinner until after you take the turn, but this wasn't enough to stop me from touching the off-road on the right on my first attempt. On the next couple of tries, I tried going as wide as possible before turning to give myself more space to utilise, but I just kept going into the off-road. However, this method was the correct one, as I did manage to wrap all the way around the U-turn eventually by braking as much as physically possible. This was undoubtedly the most difficult turn in the game to get past, but it was very satisfying when I made it and then crossed the finish line to make Mario Circuit possible without losing your charge jump. Peach Stadium has a 270-degree turn, which you'd think would be harder than Mario Circuit's 180-degree turns, but here the road is a lot wider so I don't have to be quite as precise to make it around, so this track is actually a lot easier to complete. Then finally we have Rainbow Road, which of course has 6 different glider sections, so it's automatically not possible to complete. Alongside that, the road is incredibly wide throughout the whole thing, so I wasn't expecting any of the turns to cause me any problems. However, on the turn in section 4 with the long boost panel, I had way too much speed and ended up crashing headfirst into the fence. I did manage to work around it on the next attempt though by taking a wide line, avoiding the boost panel entirely. That was the only notable thing on the track though, which means that the only thing that stops this challenge being possible is the glider sections. Going into this challenge, I thought that there would be quite a lot of turns that wouldn't be doable or at least much more difficult, but I guess using the highest handling combo in the game is more overpowered than I expected. A more difficult challenge may be to see how many tracks I can complete in a constant drift, so let me know if you would like to see that in the future. If you want to see how many of the glider panels can be avoided without having to maintain your charge jump, check out this video on the screen now, or check out one of my other proper videos from this playlist. Thanks for watching.